House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move third reading of Bill 150, an act to provide for the resolution of labour disputes involving the Toronto Transit Commission.
Ms. Smith has moved third reading of Bill 150. Further debate? The member from Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak on Bill 150 today. The PC party is supporting Bill 150. However, we have some strong reservations that came out during the committee meetings, and some I'd like to share with the House our reservations and that process in the committees. We know that this bill is an important bill for the people of Toronto, for the commuters of Toronto. It's been requested by the Mayor and Council of Toronto, and it's here before us today for final reading. In our committees, we did offer up nine amendments to strengthen Bill 150, to improve Bill 150. 9 amendments to protect Toronto taxpayers from potentially excessive increases, to provide greater clarity and criteria to arbitrators, and also to provide this legislature with a oversight role and review role in 5 years' time on this legislation, because it does provide for a ministerial review in 5 years. It was quite disappointing to see that each and every one of those amendments were dismissed by the Liberal government, dismissed out of hand, I would say, with very little interest for discussion or debate on the justification and the merit of those 9 amendments. We know that this bill has its flaws. We know that the committee process is there to improve legislation, but it can only improve legislation if the people sitting on that committee come to that committee in good conscience, with goodwill, good faith, and that was not demonstrated by the Liberal members of that committee, not at all. We know that there are those who are opposed to this bill. They were talked to at the committee by delegates. One of them was Sid Ryan. Sid Ryan had some very critical things to say of this bill, very critical of some of the members on that committee as well for their actions. And he said this, Sid Ryan, who of course heads up the OFL, the Ontario Federation of Labour, and CUPE, Sid Ryan said to the member for Brant, "You play politics, sir, all the time with labor legislation and with the lives of workers in this province, and it's time to stop." He also went on to say, "You helped out the construction industry because the construction industry puts money in your election machine. You gave them car-based certification, but you said to the rest of the labour movement, you gave them the finger." That's some of the quotes by Sid Ryan to our committee over looking at this bill. Mr. Speaker, the first amendment that I want to talk about that completely disappointed me by the actions of the Liberal members was an amendment to provide a sunset review of this legislation in 5 years' time. And the clause had 2 components that differ from the original bill. The first was that it would put a time frame to end that review, not just a time frame to start the review. And secondly, it requested or made into law, if it had been passed, that that review would have been tabled in this legislative assembly. A review tabled in the legislative assembly. That differs from the bill itself, the way it's written, in that presently that review only gets handed to the minister. The only one who will be able to see that review of this legislation in 5 years' time will be the minister himself or herself. that really is diminishing the role and the responsibility and the obligations of the elected members of this province, the elected members who stand here and represent their constituents. All the members of this House who represent GTA ridings will not be able to look at that review. I believe that's a tremendous travesty of the due process and the protocols of an elected representative democracy. Reports reviewing our legislation must be tabled in this House so that we ourselves can take a look at it. And as I said to the members of the government benches in that committee, 5 years' time, we're not sure who's going to be sitting in this House. We're not sure which minister is going to be sitting in that portfolio. Why are you so willing to diminish and abrogate your own responsibilities when you don't even know who's going to be in government, who's going to be the minister? It is due and proper that any review of our legislation be tabled in this House every time. Absolutely, it is unequivocal. It cannot be justified that we do business behind closed doors in this province. But that's what this bill is doing. It allows business to be done behind closed doors. But the members of the Liberal benches in that committee refuse to take ownership of their own responsibilities, but more importantly, they seek to diminish the role of others in this House, which is unacceptable and intolerable in my view. Speaker, we also put forward an amendment to provide some protection for Toronto taxpayers. We have seen with essential services legislation, with arbitration, the arbitrators have very little regard for this concept of ability to pay when it comes to public sector union awards. Their ability to pay is often misconstrued by arbitrators into the ability to tax, which is, of course, near endless. So we brought forward an amendment that would have prevented excessive arbitration awards and protect Toronto taxpayers. But once again, the members of the committee, the Liberal members of that committee, dismissed that amendment out of hand, without discussion, without debate.
Shameful.
It was as if they were completely disinterested in doing their job of representing their constituents, making sure that there is some value and some improvements in that committee process. Just a complete dismissive approach. Furthermore, Speaker, we provided an amendment to provide greater clarity to arbitrators, to give them a greater understanding of the arbitration awards, on how they should be, the criteria that would be required to come up with a reasonable settlement. Once again, the Liberal members of this committee dismissed it out of hand. And we've seen this in the past, and it's something that we need to speak about in this Legislative Assembly. We've seen it, I've seen it on every committee that I've sat on, that any amendment brought forward by the opposition, and this of course is the time, committees are the time for opposition members to have input and influence and provide our constituents perspectives into legislation. But each and every committee that I've sat on, there has been no discussion, no debate from the Liberal government on any amendment, it is always dismissed and rejected as if they and their bureaucracy and their policy staff are the only ones who have any authority or any expertise to provide comments. The rest of us in here, when it comes to to this Liberal government, are unimportant, insignificant, and indeed irrelevant to the parliamentary process. That is an abrogation, Speaker, of who we are and what our jobs are here. And I do believe that someday soon, that the members of this House must stand up and find a backbone and defend their responsibilities, their obligations, and defend and advocate for the interests of their constituents. But at the present time, and in my time here with this Liberal government, I have not seen any interest at all to make this Assembly work better, to improve legislation, and it just, and I see the member from Brant who is laughing about this. Of course, he was the member that Sid Ryan was talking about in the committees. When Sid Ryan said, "You ought to be embarrassed, you ought to be ashamed," that's what Sid Ryan was talking about about the member of Brant who sat on that committee. And, you know, again, some people may think that this is just frivolous, unimportant, that this job, this privilege to represent people is a laughing matter. That's not the way I see it. It's not the way my constituents see it. And I don't believe it's the way the people of Ontario see our jobs here.
A lot of subways down in Brant.
Now, I know there's probably not a lot of subways in Brant, and the member may laugh and chuckle about all this. There's not any subways in Lanark County either, or Frontenac, or Lennox and Addington. Regardless, we still take our job serious. We still take the interests of our constituents and the taxpayers with deep interest and concern. But there's 9 amendments, reasonable, and you know, I have to give credit for a member on the Liberal side who was heading that up the committee, and he did say in it, "Thank you for the non-partisan amendment," but we're still not going to consider it. We're still not going to listen to it. It's a non-partisan. It's a but it came from you guys. It came from the opposition benches. It didn't come from our minister, so it really can't have any value now, can it? Well, that level of arrogance, that level of disregard is going to be costly. It is costly to the people of this province when elected members have that cavalier approach and dismissive interest, lack of interest in legislation. Legislation, of course, is indeed our primary role here, making sure that the legislation is effective, that it will achieve the objectives that we want to achieve, that we minimize or mitigate the possibility of unforeseen consequences. That's what 107 elected people can do if they choose to exercise their jobs and their judgment in a proper fashion. But that is not the case. It wasn't the case on the Government Appointments Committee that I sat on. It's not been a case on any of the committees that I've sat on with this Liberal government. And it really is disheartening. And I believe if our constituents the members for Brant's constituents saw, if the members from all the constituents from all those members saw the conduct of their elected representatives during that committee, they would be furious. They would be the contempt that was demonstrated is amazing. And I just have to go along, reiterate something I said in the committee. It may be fine if members of the Liberal benches, if they want to diminish their own role in this House, go ahead and do it. Okay? If you guys want to diminish yourselves, go ahead and do it. You have every right to do that. If you don't want to have an opinion, if you don't want to engage in debate and discussion and the merit of legislation, go ahead. Don't bother. Diminish your role. You have every right to do so. But you don't have the right to do it to others. Right? And that's what you're engaging in. You're not only dismissing yourselves, you're dismissing the role of others. And that is contemptible, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely contemptible that these members on the Liberal benches would do that. You're a member of the Liberal Party. If you choose to gag yourselves, to handcuff yourselves, to put blinders on, that's fine. You know, you get to deal with your constituents when you act like that. But you have no right to do that to members on this side or other members of your own party who want to advocate for their constituents. Mr. Speaker, I really have seen enough of this committee process in this House. I know why there's apathy and complacency with our members of the general public when it comes to politics. And we don't have to look any farther why that apathy and complacency is so abundant in this province. All we have to do is look at ourselves, look at the conduct of ourselves in this House, and people will see, people will understand exactly why, because there are elected members here who are laughing and chuckling. The member for Algoma thinks this is a funny and hilarious debate today, right? As the member for Brant. That's, and I guess the member for Algoma likes Fox News and he thinks he should be watching Fox News instead of engaging in debate and advocating for his constituents. This is not acceptable. And once again, why would they have prevented an amendment to this bill which would have brought the 5-year review, the sunset review, back to this House so every member could look at it, so every member could have input into whether it was working well, not working well, if it had shortcomings, if it had improvements that could be done. But no, Mr. Speaker, not acceptable to this Liberal government that reviews and reports get tabled and that we have knowledge to make informed commentary on legislation. That is unjustifiable that that amendment was turned down. Absolutely, unequivocally, it was unjustifiable. And I'd like to hear somebody from the Liberal benches say, why is it important that they remain in ignorance with legislation? Why is ignorance so blissful to the members of the Liberal Party that they will not amend legislation so that the reports come into this House so that we can all have a review. We can all take part. Why is ignorance so important to members of the Liberal benches? Why do you view that the only one that ought to have comment or to have eyes is the Minister of the day. I'm glad to see the Minister has come into the House, and would have liked to have heard his comments as well on this bill, but I'll be listening to what the Minister has to say on about third reading, and thank you very much.
Thank you.